Sita, remind me again, what was that wonderful potential label that you had for Brodie? A can-doer, can-brander? The ultimate can-brassador. How good is that? How good is Sita Sargeant too? She's the founder and co-director of She Shapes History. Many of you will know already, or you should know, it's a walking tour that unearths the trailblazing, the scandal-making, the badass sisters who made the ACT. Sita's going to tell us a bit more about it.
God, I feel really nervous. I don't usually feel nervous talking. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me to start, and what an incredible kind of duo to come after. I'm feeling really hyped about Canberra now. Like, I just want to spend the next 20 minutes talking about why I'm the city's biggest Canvassador. Sorry, Brodie. I haven't seen you starting a walking tour to share. I'm not going to just heckle people, guys. I promise this isn't just going to be me heckling people for 20 minutes, just picking on people in the room. Friday afternoons. Well, my name is Sita, and in 2021, I founded She Shapes History. She Shapes History is a social enterprise dedicated to making Australian women's history accessible, engaging, and entertaining through walking tours, social media, and special events. For today's presentation, though, I'm going to focus just on walking tours as a way of making history accessible, engaging, and entertaining. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of background about why I started She Shapes History, and then I'm going to share a few stories. And I'm going to break down why these stories, how these stories, and why telling these stories in particular places helps us kind of in this mission to recover and share the contributions of women who are shaping Australia. So, there we go. The problem. By the way, I love Ben Chifley and John Curtin. These are just the photos that I had on my laptop, easily accessible. And I'm happy to talk about why I love them afterwards. The question I usually do as an icebreaker on tours is, who is Australia's hottest Prime Minister? Tell me afterwards. My answer is usually Ben Chifley, who's the lad on the left. That's the common answer on a women's history walking tour, I will tell you that. So I noticed that Canberra had a bit of a problem when it came to publicly acknowledging the role that women had played in making Australia the nation that it is. I had just moved back here after spending 4 years living in Brisbane, and had just spent kind of the past year looking at how South Asian women's kind of stories can deepen our understanding of nation building in India. And I kind of came back and I was like ready to be hyped about Canberra, and I found myself asking again and again this really simple question: where are the women? Where are the women in the story of Australia, and particularly in the story of Canberra, our nation's capital? I kept noticing that in public spaces, bushrangers, convicts, kind of soldiers and politicians were being positioned as the main characters in the story of our country. I kept noticing that in the story of our nation, women had frequently been cast as minor characters, as wives, as daughters, as secretaries, as typists. That's it, if they had been cast at all. Countless stories had been lost, unrecorded, unvalued, and untold. And as a society, I kind of felt like, we'd forgotten that women were behind so many of the moments that had shaped Australia. So I knew that these stories were there. But I only knew this because I had a background in research. So I knew how to find information in the archives. I also had the incredible patience and interest to read really obscure novels and books and academic texts on Australian history that allowed me to kind of take out these stories. So I was interested enough to know that these stories existed. But most people don't have that. And these stories weren't being told in a way that was accessible and engaging. So most Australians just didn't realise that they were there. They didn't realise that women had been so fundamental to shaping our country. And why is this important? I believe that to close the respect gap that we have in Australian politics, society and culture, we first need to recognise and reimagine what Australian women, and particularly First Nations women, queer women, women of colour and women with disabilities have achieved in the past. If you don't believe and know that women have shaped history, you're less likely to believe that women can shape history, that they can shape our future. So it means that you're less likely to give them opportunities in the workplace, and as a woman, you're also a lot less likely to believe that you deserve those opportunities and put yourself forward for them. So by recovering these stories of how women have shaped history, we can challenge our perspectives of women today. So the solution, I'm not just a complainer, guys. I want to put that out there. I do say my 2 key character traits are complaining and then problem solving. So we've got our problem, we've got my big complaint, I've gotten grumpy at Canberra, and I'm going to fix it. So my solution, walking tours. I'd come back and I thought hey, I can do something to fix this. I can share these stories. And what better way to make history genuinely accessible than through oral storytelling, through a walking tour? So I keep coming back to this idea of kind of accessibility. And I think that accessibility is something that's kind of more than just, making sure that someone can physically move through a space, or that, you're doing image descriptions. It's about meeting people where they are at and tailoring content for them. I believe that everyone should feel comfortable engaging with Australian history. Walking tours are really, really great for this, because unlike a book, a documentary, a museum, they do not assume prior knowledge. You can adjust your story and you can meet someone where they are at. You can weave stories into a conversation that you are having with someone based on the information that they are giving you. No other medium for historical communication, I would argue, can be so reactive and adaptive to meeting an audience where it's at. So while there are many ways to learn about history, there is just nothing like a walking tour. They offer this really unique opportunity to share history in a way that is inclusive, accessible, and genuinely non-judgmental. So walking tours also, they've been used kind of globally as this tool for activism, for providing a platform for marginalised voices and perspectives to kind of share their city, to share their history. So they're really great for this because there's no barrier to entry. Anyone can run a walking tour. Anyone kind of crazy enough to want to give up their weekends for the rest of their life, you can do it too. This means that groups who have historically been excluded from sharing their story in kind of through an institution or through a book or through a documentary can now share their story. You cannot say that about kind of almost any other form of historical communication. So, my next slide. Reclaiming Canberra. So I've gone for really clickbaity titles. So walking tours kind of enable us to reclaim the story of Canberra, Australia's capital city. And I would argue in reclaiming the story of Canberra as Australia's capital, we're also reclaiming the story of Australia. So why Canberra? So Canberra is Australia's capital, so I feel like I've said that too many times now. Canberra is meant to be the one place in Australia where all Australians are meant to be able to come and feel represented. Politically, culturally, if you're an Australian, this is meant to be your city. Even if you weren't born here or currently live here, I say to any Australian who's visiting, you are meant to be able to come here and feel at home. This city belongs to you and it was created for you. From the street and suburb names to the galleries, to the archives, to the libraries, Canberra is here to house the stories of our nation and to set us up for the future. Yet, from the very beginnings of Canberra's origins as Australia's capital, we have kind of women present. But we also have this kind of pushing out of women. So I am gonna now share 2.5 stories. I'm not gonna share 3 really in-depth stories because I know that we have time compressions. So I'm going to tell a story that I think a lot of you might have heard if you're kind of as big of a Cambassador as I am, but I'm going to tell it in a really different way, and I'm going to tell it in a way that we tell it on tours. And I've reframed this story that is a well-known story in Canberra so that it is entertaining and engaging, but more than that, so it's relatable. I want people to be able to see themselves in this story. So, I'm of course talking about Marion Mahoney Griffin. So, I won't grab the microphone to do this. In 1901, just as Australia was federating and deciding what sort of nation we wanted to be, there was a man in Chicago named Walter who kept telling his wife Marion that this newly federated Australian nation was going to need a capital city, and that he was going to be the one to design this capital city. So it takes the Australian government a little while to kind of get its shit together, and it's not until like the late, 1908s, 1909s that we finally come around to going, okay, we're ready. We're ready to put the call out to architects around the world to design Australia's capital. And he hears that they finally put this call out, and he does what every procrastinator amongst us can relate to, and he waits and waits and waits. I relate to this on a very deep level. But during this entire time period that the competition is open, he's going to all these dinner parties with Marion and being like, oh, I'm going to be the one to design Australia's capital city, guys. I've got all of these ideas. It's going to look really flash. And finally, the competition's about a couple weeks out from closing, and Marion just completely cracks the shit at a dinner party. He's kind of been going off, and she's like, you know what? You might be able to kind of whip something incoherent up in 2 hours, but it is going to take me weeks to actually do some research into the natural landscape, to actually, translate your incoherent visions into something that looks like a map and that looks like it could be a city. And shockingly, he got his shit together after being kind of publicly called out at a dinner party. And it ends up being Marion who translates Walter's kind of incoherent vision for a city that could be anywhere into a city that is Canberra. She's the one who does all of this research into our natural landscape and ends up drawing the designs that end up winning them the competition. But Marion's name, to the point actually that Walter even famously says, "My wife is the genius, I'm only the businessman." But we don't see Marion's names on that competition entry. And it's because they thought if they put a woman's name there, if it's the 1910s, no one is going to take it seriously or even look at it. But it means that from Canberra's kind of very origins as Australia's capital city, we have a woman having co-design the space that we live in. So she is this absolute kind of trailblazer. She was the very kind of second woman in America to graduate with a degree in architecture. She's Frank Lloyd Wright's very first staff member. She's just a huge figure kind of in and up. By the way, Frank Lloyd Wright was a terrible boss for anyone. Absolutely. He used to do this really, really fun, this is an aside, this is why I always go overtime on my tours and why no one loves that. He used to do this thing where every Friday night he would ask his staff to submit their best designs, and then he would pick his favourites, and he'd kind of on his great European holidays kind of take them around Europe and be like, these are my designs. So there's actually now we're kind of finding that quite a few of his designs are being attributed to Marion. So that's a fun fact about Frank. Is this my next one? Oh yeah. So, even though Canberra was a city that was co-designed by a woman, it's not a city that really made space for women to come and shape history. And this is my favourite example of this. So, when Old Parliament House opened in 1927, 25 years after women had gained the right to kind of vote and stand for federal parliament, they didn't actually include any toilets for female parliamentarians. So it meant that in 1943, when Dorothy Tangi and Enid Lyons, our first kind of female MP and senator, are elected, if they want to use the toilet, they have to duck home on their lunch break, use the toilet that was for visitors, or Dorothy would take off her shoes and leave it outside a men's toilet to let people know that she was in there. And it wouldn't be until 1974 that they end up installing a toilet for women. And I've got an image of that toilet up the top. What they did is they boxed up a male urinal and they called it a day. You can go visit it today. It's a women's only part of the museum. And I work in Old Parliament House, and the toilet on my floor that I have to use has a urinal in it, which is very fun. Showing that, like, this just wasn't a building that was made for women. Like, we just didn't want women here shaping history. Yet they ended up, it also means that they had to be really kind of subversive and creative in how they did it. And it means that when we're looking for those stories as kind of researchers and storytellers, we need to be a lot more kind of creative and subversive in how we find them. So before I kind of finish up, I want to share with you one more story. And this story is like, this is probably one of my favourite stories to tell, which is why I'm going to tell it, even though it's not explicitly Canberra related. It is Australia related though. And I am then going to kind of talk about why this story works. And this story, I love telling it because I think it really challenges how we think about Australian history, and particularly how we think about Australian women's history. So this is the story of Fanny Finch. Has anyone heard of Fanny Finch? You're all in for a treat. So, Fanny Finch was the very first woman to vote in Australia. She voted in 1856. This is almost 50 years before women gained the right to vote. She is perhaps the most unlikely, which also means that she's probably one of the first women in the world to have voted. She's perhaps the most unlikely woman to be the first woman to vote in Australia. She was a single mother of 4. She was a woman of colour of African British heritage, and she was living in rural Victoria. So at this point, I feel you're all probably wondering, how did Fanny, this woman of colour, this single mum, this woman living in a rural area, become the first woman to vote? Well, Fanny's story begins in an orphanage in London. This isn't the kind of orphanage that Charles Dickens wrote about, though. It's actually fairly reasonable in terms of the conditions. And there she was able to gain the skills necessary to migrate to Australia as a labourer. And on her journey to Australia, she ends up meeting the man who would soon become her husband, Joseph. Now, I'm sorry guys, Joseph turns out to be a bit of a dodgy bloke. And once they arrive and kind of set up their life here, Joseph, keeps getting into little tiffs with the law and keeps, like when the police would come knocking, he keeps trying to frame Fanny for crimes that she didn't commit. What does that look like? He would steal a bunch of things, leave it in their living room. The police would come knocking. They'd go, "Whose is this, Joseph?" And then he'd be like, "Oh, it belongs to the missus." So there were multiple points in their marriage where Fanny almost ended up going to jail as a result of being married to Joseph. So she does something that's really remarkable. She ends up packing up their 4 kids, one of whom has a disability, and crossing the border from South Australia to rural Victoria. And there, she completely restarts her life. She starts a really successful pub and becomes known around town as this woman that you can count on. But not everyone in the town is a fan of Fanny, and there's a local pub kind of down the street, nowhere near as successful as Fanny's, that's owned by a local politician. And he keeps working with the police to get Fanny's pub shut down. And after one particularly aggressive raid where they said that they had mistaken her for someone else, and I want to say, guys, colonial Australia is more diverse than you think. It's not that diverse, you can make that argument. She ends up taking matters into her own hands. And she writes to the local paper, which again is really remarkable for women of that era. And it means that we have her words. And this is what she said. She says, "I am a woman of but few words and plain spoken, but I have worked hard." And she talks about how she hasn't worked hard for herself, but for her children, and how she deserves an apology, and how she deserves better, and how she deserves for this not to happen again. And then she's someone who's gotten so angry that, I don't know if any of you have ever been in this position where you're just so furious at something that you actually look to the law and you're like, what can I do? And she sees in the law that it says that if you bear a miner's license or pay your rates, you can vote. So it says any persons. So she, as a woman who owns her own business, and because she had left her husband, it was in her name is on all of the rates. So that next election, she rocks up to the town hall holding her rates notice, and they're not able to kind of say, no, you can't vote, because the law said any persons could. So through this loophole in the law, Fanny Finch, a woman of colour, kind of, like a single mum of 4, becomes the very first woman to vote in Australia. And I love this story because I think it does a few things. It really challenges how we think about Australian history. But I also think this is such an Australian story. It's a woman who owns a pub who's cracked the shits with a politician. Do you really get more Australian than that? And it's someone who, just by showing up and calling something out has kind of shaped Australian history. And I love stories like this because I think that it makes it so much easier for us to be able to see ourselves in the story of Australia, and for people to be able to see and feel more connected, and to think of the different ways that you're maybe shaping history, that it's not always, through politics. Sometimes it's just by being a community member. So, what's my next slide? I'm trying to think of, it makes people feel more connected to history. Things I just said, I didn't realise I did a slide for that. I'll wrap up now. So, the stories we tell about ourselves matter. They shape our understanding of the past, they influence our present, and they guide our future. So, in the story of our nation, women have frequently been cast as minor characters, yet on our tours we really work to reveal through this really relatable and engaging storytelling that they're pivotal in our nation's story. And we tell these stories in a way that is really kind of relatable and down to earth, because we want you to be able to come away having seen yourself in the story of Australia. We don't want there to be any barriers to entry when it comes to engaging with Australian history. So I wanted to kind of thank everyone for, listening to me ramble for 20 minutes. And if you're keen to I think I did a final slide. Yes, thank you. If you're keen to kind of keep engaging with me, you can always shoot me an email or see me on a tour. But thank you.